A deal was on the table. Iran was ready. Trump blew it up, and his own people said so. Not critics, not Iran. His own staff. 3 weeks into a ceasefire. Pakistani intermediaries in the room. American officials privately telling CNN the deal was close enough to touch. Then Trump posted what Iran had agreed to before they agreed to it. The talks collapsed within hours. One person familiar with the talks told CNN, the Iranians didn't appreciate POTUS, negotiating through social media. That's a diplomatic way of saying he killed it. And I get why everyone's asking why. But a forensic psychologist who studies behavior, not politics, watched his press conferences over the past few months and said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. She didn't say he made a bad call. She said his behavior has changed. Not more of the same. Qualitatively different. More impulsive than his own historical baseline. Speech fragmenting under pressure in ways it didn't before. Posts that contradict his own negotiating position in real time. She called it frontal lobe disinhibition. The clinical way of saying the part of the brain that creates the gap between I want to do this and what happens if I do is no longer working the way it used to. And when I sat with that, I stopped thinking about the deal. I started thinking about a question nobody's asking out loud. What happens when the most powerful person in the world loses reliable access to the part of himself that makes decisions? That's not a political question. It's a psychological one. And it has a very specific answer. You've met someone like this. Maybe it was a manager at a job you had in your 20s. Smart guy. Good at what he did. Everyone respected him. But if you disagreed with him in a meeting, even once, even about something small, he'd go quiet. Not angry. Just quiet. And you'd notice his jaw tighten slightly. And he'd move on like it didn't happen. But the next week your name wouldn't be on the project anymore. No explanation. No conversation. Just gone. And you'd learn, in the way everyone in that office learned, don't do that again. Not because he was cruel. Because somewhere underneath all that confidence, there was a question he had never answered. Am I enough? And every disagreement, no matter how small, no matter how reasonable, landed directly on that question. A psychoanalyst named Heinz Kohut spent his career studying people like that. He called it a scaffolded identity, a self built entirely from the outside in, not from internal conviction, from reflected images, the title, the corner office, the look on someone's face when they realize who they're talking to. From the outside, extraordinary confidence. From the inside, every piece is load-bearing, because without the scaffolding, there is no structure underneath. Now here's where Kohut gets precise. A real self, one with a foundation, can absorb a loss, integrate it, update, move. The scaffolding cannot update. It has one response when threatened: destroy the threat before it lands. Kohut called this narcissistic rage, and he was careful to separate it from ordinary anger. Ordinary anger has a goal. You want something. Anger is the instrument. Narcissistic rage has no goal outside itself. It fires to eliminate the threat to the image, not to achieve anything after, not to calculate what comes next. Remove the threat. Now, hold that. Now look at what was happening in Iran. The deal on the table was By any honest measure, a significant American win. Iran's military destroyed, economy in free fall, negotiators sitting across the table from a position of weakness. But the deal required Iran to still be standing. It required their team to still have demands. It required the world to see two sides reaching an agreement, not one side forcing complete surrender. And here's what Kohut's framework predicts almost mechanically. The closer the deal gets, the more dangerous the moment becomes. Not when things fall apart, right when they're about to close on terms that feel like compromise. That's when the scaffolding registers a threat. That's when the rage fires, not to destroy the deal, to destroy the version of the outcome that would require the image to update. But here's what doesn't add up. This isn't new. Trump has had this scaffolding his whole career. The rage has always been there. It fired in business deals. It fired in elections. It fired in courtrooms. So why is the psychologist saying something is different now? That's the question that matters. And the answer is the frontal lobe, not as a separate theory. As the answer to exactly that question, the frontal lobe does one thing nothing else in the brain does. It holds the gap between the rage firing and what you actually do about it. That half second where something else is still possible. What happens if I post this? What does closing look like from their side? What does Iran need to be able to say yes? For most people, that gap is invisible. You don't notice it because it's always there. You only notice it's gone when you watch someone who's lost it. The psychologist describes specific changes in the past few months. Posts going out before the consequences calculated. Press conferences fragmenting the longer they run. I can't tell you. I don't know, said in front of every camera in the world, about his own war strategy. She won't diagnose him, but she names what she sees. Frontal lobe disinhibition. Qualitatively different, even by his own baseline. And now, the two things are running together. Kohut's rage, which has always been there, and a narrowing gap that used to interrupt it. The deal approaches, the scaffolding registers, threat, the rage, fires, eliminate. The frontal lobe reaches for the gap, and the gap isn't fast enough anymore. The post goes out. Iran gets humiliated publicly. The deal collapses, and the man who needed the war to end just guaranteed it continues. Not by choosing to, by architecture. Now, I know what the pushback is. Nixon did this on purpose. Kissinger built a whole doctrine around it. Act unpredictable enough, and your enemy negotiates faster. The Madman Theory. And if you're watching Trump and thinking this is calculated chaos, that's not a stupid read. But the Madman Theory has one requirement. The madness has to look controlled. It works because your enemy believes you could pull back and are choosing not to. The moment it looks like you can't, the math flips entirely. You don't rush to the table with a man who's lost control. You wait. Because a man who can't stop escalating will eventually escalate past the point where any deal is possible. And then the outcome gets decided by exhaustion, not negotiation. The Iranians have been reading American presidents for 40 years. They see a man who set 3 separate deadlines and extended every one. A ceasefire he said he'd never extend, now in its 3rd week. Posts getting more erratic, not more strategic. The longer the pressure holds, they're not afraid of him. They're watching the clock run out. Nietzsche wrote about power his whole life. And most people read him wrong. They read him as celebrating it, the will to power, dominate or be dominated, that kind of thing. But the thing Nietzsche kept returning to, almost anxiously, if you read him carefully, was the trap inside it. He described what happens to a person who constructs an identity so rigid, so defended, so dependent on the world constantly confirming it, that eventually the will to power stops being about achieving anything. It becomes about preventing any outcome that contradicts the image. He called that the most insidious inversion, because from the outside, it still looks like strength, but underneath, it is pure defense. A man frozen at the moment just before reality could prove him wrong. His verdict, a man who cannot risk his identity, has already stopped living. He is only defending. Now think about what that looks like at 2 a.m. in the most powerful office in the world. Not a strategic session, not a war room, just a man, alone with his phone, feeling something he couldn't name if you asked him directly. A deal almost done in a way that doesn't feel like winning. A threat with no face. No enemy to point at. Just a feeling. And the only tool that makes it stop is the phone in his hand. Jeffrey Sachs, political economist, former UN advisor, put the external logic in 4 sentences. He craves approval. He thinks he gets it by winning. But he cannot define winning. So he cannot stop. A man who cannot define winning is not chasing victory. He is running from a feeling. The feeling that he is not enough. That feeling has followed him into every room he has ever entered, every deal, every election, every lawsuit, every tower with his name on it, in letters you can read from a mile away, including the most powerful room on earth. The room didn't free him from it. It gave him more instruments to run from it with. And here's the thing about running from a feeling using a war as the instrument. The feeling doesn't get tired. The war does. The psychologist said one line I keep coming back to. He absolutely believes every last word he's saying. That doesn't mean it's correct, but he means it. She said it as a warning, not reassurance, and she was right. Because the most dangerous person in a negotiation is not the liar. A liar knows the gap between what they're saying and what's true. That gap is information. You can work with it. The dangerous person is the one for whom that gap is closed. The one for whom posting that Iran agreed made it true enough to act on. The one for whom threatening to destroy a civilization on Easter Sunday was not performance. It was identity. Look, I want to be honest about something. Diagnosing a sitting president from press conferences and social media posts is not clean science. I'm not a psychologist, and I could be wrong about the mechanism. But here's what I'm not wrong about. The ceasefire is 3 weeks old. The blockade is in effect. Talks in Islamabad collapsed after 21 hours. A new Iranian proposal is sitting in Washington. And Trump says he's not satisfied. Somewhere in all of that, a man is holding his phone, feeling something he probably couldn't name if you asked him, about to do something that the gap in his frontal lobe used to be able to stop. Not because he wants this to get worse, because the architecture that would have stopped him has been dissolving for longer than anyone said out loud. And here's the thing that stays with me. This isn't just a story about Trump. Every person who has ever built their identity around a story that cannot be updated, who has ever needed the world to keep confirming something they were never fully sure of, has some version of this architecture. Most of us never get the kind of power that turns it into a war, but the mechanism is the same. The scaffolding is the same. The rage is the same. The narrowing gap is the same. The only difference is the scale of what gets destroyed when the gap finally closes. There's a question this video never asked. If Trump can't close this, who is? Every administration has people whose names don't appear in press conferences. Advisors, generals, strategists. When the man at the top is running on identity protection instead of strategic calculation, power doesn't disappear. It moves to someone you're not watching, toward an outcome that might have nothing to do with ending a war, who that is, and what they want. That's the next video.